everyone, welcome to our very first Gorilla Presents. And today, thank you very much for joining us. This is as I said, this is our first Gorilla Presents webinar, and each month we'll be addressing a different topic in online behavioural research. I'm Jo Evershed, I'm your host this evening, and I'm joined by our expert panel, who I will introduce in a minute. What you can do for the time being is in the chat. You can, as I said, we're going to be having one of these every month. So you could write into the chat with suggestions or get in touch with us via Twitter, Facebook to let us know what you'd like us to discuss on future Gorilla Presents episodes. Today's webinar is all about online teaching, specifically teaching psychological research methods online. Academia has had quite a pivot quite quickly this year and moved the majority of its content online. I don't know about you, but I'm already feeling pretty exhausted. It's been a really busy year. That was my cat just jumping onto the desk, because like everybody else at the moment here in the UK, we're working from home. Many of us are juggling family, homeschooling, and all different sorts of things. So please forgive both me and our panelists if at any moments we look a little bit blindsided. So today we've brought together a panel of experts, and we're going to discuss what's worked in taking research methods courses online, what hasn't worked, what's been difficult, and what we need to continue to do in order to deliver top quality content. So tonight, let me introduce to you our expert panel. We have Professor Daniel Richardson from UCL, Professor Victoria Bourne from Royal Holloway University, Dr. Julia Ouzia from King's College London, and Dr. Joshua Balsters here from Gorilla. Now, the format this evening, I'm going to ask each of our experts to give a sort of 5-minute-ish introduction to what they've been doing, where they're going to tell you about what they've been doing, what's worked, what's been difficult, and perhaps what they do differently with hindsight. So with that, Daniel Richardson, over to you.
Oh, you're on mute, Daniel.
Yes, I know I'm on mute. An entire time. I didn't do that once in my lecture, and now I do it every time. Hello. I'm about to boast about my experience of teaching online, having just fallen flat on my face at the first hurdle, which is excellent. So yes, teaching online. Let me just go back a little bit and give you some context of why I'm here, and in fact why all of you are here too. So several years ago I taught social psychology at UCL, and little Jo Evershed was one of my undergraduates, and she saw me trying to collect data from people in the middle of lectures. I would use like audience response clickers, and it was very frustrating and didn't quite work. And part of her frustration with my teaching led her to think, well, we could build a system online to build this. So the inadequacy of my teaching spurred her on, and is the reason we're all here. Now you have me to thank and my inadequacies for that. My particular sort of introduction to teaching research methods came about 5 years ago when I switched from doing social psychology to doing the big intro course online for all of our undergraduates. I've been doing that for about 5 years. And what we wanted to do from the outset was something slightly different to many intro classes, which is to get students to get their hands dirty, to try and get this link between evidence and inquiry. That's what the course is called, evidence inquiry. So to get them collecting their own data right from the outset. So rather than their research career being gradually building it up to the third year where they could do their own project, right from the outset, they're testing their own ideas. And this was about the time that Gorilla was starting up too. So we've had it from the outset as the tool for students to use right then. So I do most of the lecturing on, all of the lecturing on evidence and inquiry, where we talk about the theory, and then we might raise an idea that gets picked up in their lab classes, where they might do an experiment using Gorilla and collecting their data. And we have this sort of back and forth between ideas that we discuss in the lectures and picking up how you might collect the evidence in various sort of lab classes that are taught by another member of staff. But we're all trying to connect these curriculum. Typically, UCL used to be, they did lectures separately from labs, separately from seminars, and we're trying to link them all together. So one thing that we try and do at the end of the first year, end of the first term in our class, is they do a project using the IAT, which is the implicit association test, which is a way to use reaction times to see what people's biases and prejudices are. So we have a little project where in groups of about 4 or 5, the students think of their own not their own hypothesis about a bias that they want to investigate. Do people think people with glasses, do they associate them with intelligence? Do they associate people with blonde hair differently? We had one hypothesis that, do you associate antisocial characteristics with wearing a mask or not? Which I thought was kind of clever. Do you associate thoughts about climate change with things about the individual or the group? Because that has consequences for how you might take action. So they're really sort of clever ways to measure these implicit attitudes. They came with the ideas by themselves. They found the stimuli to operationalize and depict these things. And then they used a Gorilla template, which we wrote for the IIT, and just sort of slotted their stimuli in. And then they collected their own data and analyzed it. And then we had a big poster session at the end of term. What has changed, of course, this term is that everything has gone online, which, because we've been using Gorilla and other things the past 5 years, was a surprisingly small change for us, really, in terms of the research methods. In terms of just the lecturing, we've obviously had to do stuff very differently, but the lab component of it really isn't that much difference. The difference is that people used to sit around a computer together, figuring out their coding problems. Now they're doing it over Zoom session screen sharing. But aside from that, there's a reasonably small change this year, which is remarkable because we've also, of course, doubled our student intake due to massive government and institutional incompetence. We now have 330 students as opposed to 180. But that's one of the nice things about online teaching is it scales because you don't need a bigger lecture room. So luckily, we haven't had too many difficulties. There are all sorts of problems and challenges with online teaching, of course, that I can talk about. But the research element of it has remained the same, this same pattern of raising an idea, then coming up with their own hypothesis, using a template that we structured for them, slotting in their ideas, and then collecting their own data. The one thing that changed, of course, we had to do the poster session online. I can tell you about how we did that later if anyone is interested. It was all virtual. We had little cartoon characters wandering around a space, visiting posters that worked quite well. But yeah, that's the key to this, I think, is all about, and the lesson that we've learned is all about doing things gradually and structuring. So first of all, they would run themselves as a participant in this experiment, like the IAT, then would introduce the theory about how you operationalize concepts and get stimuli, then would have these little tutorials on how to slot the things into Gorilla. So it's quite sort of gradual how you're letting them only tinker with a tiny bit at once. But by the end of the year, they are just about able to go out and do their own projects. So by the end of the second term, I'll tell you about this, then I'll finish. They do another project that's sort of similar, but they have a little more scope. So this one is called the Charity Project, and they have to decide, basically they want to create 2 stimuli that are asking an appeal for donations. The students pick their own charity. It was a shelter for domestic abuse victims last time. And they just basically pick 2 versions of a charity pitch and see if one increases hypothetical donations. And the idea is that they can come up with their hypotheses from the other lectures that they're taking. So they have lectures on individual differences. So do extroverts more like to respond to one type of appeal? They have ones on social psychology, so can use sort of group identification things to increase it. And they also do memory decision making. So can use Kahneman and Tversky like tweaks to change it. So they pick their hypothesis from everywhere, and they have very different ideas, but they all come down to a really simple Gorilla template again. And I think that's the key, a really simple design. Just put 2 different versions of stimuli, measure something, and then you end up just a t-test or a correlation. And again, the last sort of thing that we've learned about this is often the students push back and say, I want to do this, I want to have 3 different stimulus sets, I want to do this. What you explain to them is, well, part of the challenge of forming a scientific hypothesis is working within these constraints and keeping it simple. And that's not really a limitation. That's part of the power of the scientific method, is really simplifying and reducing it. And that gives you the power to make stronger conclusions. So
Daniel,
constraining the paradigm is one of the big lessons we've learned.
Thank you so much, Daniel. I love how you put your students into the driving seat and have got them being creative with the theory that they're learning right from day one. Victoria, over to you. What have you been doing over at Royal Holloway?
So at Royal Holloway, we've always had a very integrated research methods and statistics training that kind of flows through in quite a linear way from the very beginning through to 3rd year. And kind of similar to what Daniel was saying, is kind of building that level of independence. So what we used to have in what we had in 1st year, and what we're still trying to do as much as we can, is all of the statistics are done by hand, which has been an interesting one to convert to online teaching. And then they sort of collect data from each other, and they collect cohort data, which they then have different elements of independence when they're looking at it to write up. Then in second year, they do group projects, which are kind of semi-designed. And then in third year, they were going on to do their group project. In terms of the way that we've changed our delivery, we've tried to keep the kind of broad structure kind of similar. The lecture side of things we've flipped. One of the most challenging bits has been the workshops, where they would usually be sitting working on the computer, and you can wander behind them and look over their shoulder and say, you didn't click that bit. But the actual running of the research projects, we've had to change a fair amount. And I think one of the things that's happened is all of the past 10 months has really accelerated things that we'd planned on doing anyway, but always said, yeah, next year we'll do it, next year we'll do it, and you never quite got around to do it, and then suddenly we just had to do it. So I think previously about 30% of our, about 50% of our third year projects were online data collection, but they didn't really get to see the online data collection and use things like Gorilla before third year. And then when all this happened, we said, okay, all the data collection's got to go online from the first year undergraduate right the way through. So then we had to think quickly about how we get that level of training in to allow them to do everything online without having had that first and second year taught to the third years. So in terms of the third years, what we put together over the summer was this combination of our own resources combined with the resources that are also available through Gorilla for the students to use. And then a kind of simplified version of that for the second years. And then Luke Kendrick has worked a lot, has been doing sort of most of the work on this in terms of the second years. What we did was we used the existing Gorilla experiments and got the students just to add their own little element into it. So whether it was kind of adding an independent variable, so it was, okay, you pick which experiment you want, and then you have to add something into it which will become an IV, so some kind of binary or categorical variable. So they're getting that really simple. So we had to really simplify it down because they hadn't had that basic training, but because they had that huge list of experiments that were already there for them, we were able to do that quite easily. So they were sort of learning how to do the randomization, counterbalancing, and getting it all set up. So it's been a very quick learning process to adapt to it, but it seems to have gone pretty well so far. And yeah, they're all online collecting data. Yeah, so I think that's
brilliant. I'm just so inspired by how much you've managed to put together and how much freedom students have to do their own research. It's really quite something. Julia, would you like to speak next about what you've been doing at King's College London?
Yes, gladly. So I've been involved in research methods teaching on and off for the last 7 years, but what I want to talk about was really a practical session within the biological psychology module that I co-lead. And we wanted a language practical to replace something else. And I'm just gonna share my screen, and we've done something quite similar to what Daniel and Victoria have already talked about. So I took a programmed task from Gorilla, which was an LDT. I replicated this for the number of groups we have, and then created a demo version which I used to, because one of the things I've learned, if you work with doctoral researchers, with doctoral colleagues, you basically have to create a video, a screencast to explain something like this to them, because it's just so complex. So I've had a demo version for the teaching staff, and then a play version where I said, if you want to try this out, here's your version that you can mess up however you want. And what we had is a task that was programmed that I took from the repository, and that just had the words missing, and we were looking for frequent, infrequent, long and short words and matched non-words. And what we did is, in the online practical, we sent students into breakout rooms and said, okay, group 1, your task is to take the 4 shortest words. So they did a take-home experiment before, and all the words they had generated at home I put online on Moodle, and we said, okay, group 1, you take the 4 shortest words from Moodle, and then you find 4 length matched non-words using this resource. And then they came back and we typed it in, and then we won the study and looked at the data. We actually, we actually went from sort of programming to analysis in an hour online frame, which was really tight and somewhat chaotic. But it actually worked better than I expected it to work. And it's sort of, I have a great passion for involving the students, similar to what Dania and Victoria just said, to involving them from day one in the making of the knowledge, because I think that is how historically I have learned the most once I've actually created a piece of knowledge. I sort of, it went from here to my gut a little bit more, so yeah.
I love that message is coming across from all 3 of you so strongly, that, you know, one of the bits that's most exciting when you finally get to university and you're studying science is to finally move away from studying science history and what other people have had to do before, and to be put into the driving seat and discovering your own things for yourself. And it gives you such a, I mean, for me, that was the bit that just like excited me beyond measure. But also I think what it gives science students is this takeaway of like, only you can convince yourself whether what you found is true or not true. Like, how well did you research it? How well did you operationalize it? You could even lie to yourself with your data if you wanted to. And that ability to critique the evidence in front of you transfers not just like immediately from psychological science, but from all other areas of your life as well. Now, Josh, you've been doing something different to teach research methods, haven't you? Why don't you tell us what you've been up to?
Yeah, sure. That'd be a pleasure. So just a little background, first of all. So before I joined Gorilla, I was a lecturer at Royal Holloway. And I have to say, especially during lockdown, I've definitely missed my morning coffees with Victoria and a bit of chocolate and a gossip. But yeah, I kind of spent that time at Royal Holloway. I wasn't teaching research methods there, but I was teaching, I had lots of project supervision, and I've been doing lots of project supervision since my postdocs in Ireland at Trinity, but also postdocs in Switzerland. And I think the key thing that I found in all those different places, even though I worked with some incredibly bright students, is there was definitely a distinction between kind of understanding a hypothesis, understanding independent, dependent variables, and operationalizing that and turning an idea into a real experiment. And I think for me, that's where I've always loved Gorilla. Kind of slightly hipster. I was using Gorilla before the pandemic, before everyone else is using it. And that's what I've really liked about Gorilla, this idea that it really helps students understand not just a hypothesis, but how to turn a hypothesis into a kind of a real working experiment and how to actually answer the questions. And I try to keep that idea going with Gorilla Academy, which is something that we've been putting together on Gorilla. At the moment, it's just me, but we're always looking for other people, for a bit of variety, other people to talk about what they like to do. The idea was try to have a bit of a funnel, so having a kind of a broad introduction to some kind of topic. So far, we've had, I've talked about attention, talked about speech perception, learning, and social influence, and kind of give a broad introduction to these topics. You then go on to how to build an experiment, and I take a paper in each one of those topics, kind of try to highlight where you find what you need to know to recreate that experiment in Gorilla. Everything we do in Gorilla as well, we try to make it open access and open source. So all of these experiments, you can watch me build it on these YouTube videos, and it's also on open materials in Gorilla if you want to clone a copy for yourself and adapt it. We also go through the analysis side, so how to, once you get the data, how to work with, for example, Excel to pre-process things, also working with RStudio. And again, the data you can freely download, the scripts, they're freely available as well. And they are RStudio scripts that I write. So it's all there for anyone to download and recreate. It's also there if you want just to adapt it and work and build on top of it. And very happy for this to become kind of teaching resources for anyone who ever wants to download it and do their own thing with it. I mean, that sounds absolutely great. So, I mean, that's pretty much where I've been coming from, kind of trying to build this library of different kind of research methods lectures.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you so much, Josh. That's really useful to hear. If you're wondering where to find Gorilla Academy, you go to our support pages and it's like the second box down. It says Gorilla Academy, click on it. And you can see all of those materials that Josh has been creating. So what we're going to do now is go to questions. When we were setting up this first Gorilla Presents, various subscription administrators had been in touch with me, and when I've been chatting to people, they'd said, we want to take our research methods course online, and I'd love to talk to people who are already doing it and like just quiz them about particular questions I have. So this is your opportunity to ask these 4 experts your questions. So I think the way we'll do it is we'll put your question in the chat and then I'll read them out. If you can change your name, if you're going to ask your question, change your name to first name at and then the university that you're at. It's always wonderful to see the wide variety of where people are coming from. And then I can read out your questions and hopefully the panel can answer. If there are particular questions that you want from a particular panel member, put that in as well, and I will take it from there. So yeah, we'll take questions. Now, we had some questions while people are putting their questions in. We had some questions sent in earlier. So there's one question from Joshua Payne, which is, how do you overcome the barriers for students who are apprehensive or fearful of technology and software in general, or for students who have low confidence in IT? Daniel or Victoria, do either of you want to speak to that? Or Julia?
One small suggestion is to do is if their first work is done in group work. Often if you split them up into sort of 3 or 4, you'll find that one of them has been coding since they were 4 or something, and they will sort of pull that resource a little bit, and then that'll be an introduction. So don't throw them in as individuals, let them use the expertise that now exists amongst the group. As a sort of aside, I have to say that I think we might overestimate these things a little bit. When we started doing this and saying we're going to get first years to code entirely by themselves, this sounds almost everyone older than me in the department said that'll never work. They need about a year of training. And we just basically hurled them in and they all pretty much swam. I think the younger generations, of course, you should imagine, are so much more comfortable than people our age with these things. They just use these things much more easily. So we were worried about this, and it turned out to be mostly unfounded, particularly, as I say, if they start off in groups.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Daniel. Victoria, Julia, anything to add?
Yeah, so I very much agree, and I think they can cope with a lot more than we think they can often. One of the things that I'm a really big fan of in terms of trying to support students who are particularly anxious, I think there's a real tendency when they're worried about the kind of the IT and they think they're not a computer person or a maths person, is that kind of, they tend to hide and really disengage. And one of the things I'm a really big fan of is having kind of weekly online quizzes. And it's the easiest way to pick up if they've disengaged. And if they're doing a quiz every week and they're doing okay, then you know that they're pretty much doing okay. And when you've got a large number of students, you really need that kind of way of monitoring students, because you simply can't monitor them all personally and get to know them all. So I think having that kind of weekly check-in that they're actually doing it and they're understanding it is completely invaluable, and it kind of forces them to not procrastinate and hide.
Can you give an example of the type of like quiz questions that you'd ask?
Well, the way we've got it set up is the way the teaching works for first and second year is they have a lecture, which is now a flipped lecture. And then they have a workshop where they go and do the stats or some methods training on the computer. And then later on in the week, they have a 2-hour lab class where they're actually kind of doing research practically. So the way that we've done the quizzes is they have 10 questions per week. 5 of them are kind of theoretical kind of questions, which are taken from the lecture. And the other 5 are taken from the practical workshop. So it's actually the answers to what we've asked them to do. So as far as I'm concerned, if they can answer 5 theoretical questions and they can give me the answers from the workshop, then they've engaged that week and they've understood it. And that means they've got the knowledge to move on. And we release the answers and the scores at the end of each week. So every week students know whether they've understood it or whether they need to do a bit more revision before they move on to their next week. So it's that kind of constant feedback, so they understand their own learning.
That is such a great idea. Julia, do you have any other tips for engagement?
Yeah, so specifically with project students, I don't know that experience with the first years because I kind of forced them to do it and don't take no for an answer. But the project students and mine all have pretty ambitious, complex, multi-task projects. I do 2 things. I do a day where I say I'm only doing boring admin today, emails, that sort of thing. I'm on Teams all day. Put this aside to work on your programming, and you can call me uninvited between 9 to 5 and just sort of bounce back and forth ideas rather than get stuck in something. And the other thing I do, especially in sort of a repeated measures paradigm, I say, okay, I'm gonna do the first for you, sharing my screen. We're gonna record this so you can get back to the recording later. And we just go through it step by step, and I try and make it sort of engaging and a little silly sometimes as well. If I'm doing a lexical decision task and I'm like, here's what happens if you do that. And I put Mickey Mouse and Minnie Mouse in as terms instead of the actual words to just make it more of a conversation than a thing you have to do to progress. Because this is supposed to be fun, this is not supposed to be scary, so yeah.
That's really cool. Yes, I think humour is always a great way of getting students engaged. I know Daniel was one of the most amazing lecturers that I've ever had. I still dine out slightly on his lectures. The story I tell is Daniel turned up with nappies and chocolate mousses and put the chocolate mousse on the nappies in order to teach us about discuss. And it's still, the very thought of it makes me squirm. But Yeah, so I think, yeah, humor and using all of those tricks we have in order to make your memories more salient really helps. Now, another question that we had come in was how to balance and more importantly, I think, integrate the theory and philosophy of experimental methods with the practical aspects of experimental design and technical skills. And certainly I've heard from all of you, you're giving them each of those experiences, but is there an extra step you take to make sure those get integrated, or do you just trust that happens if you've covered all of the components? Victoria, I know integration has been a big part of the Royal Holloway curriculum. Do you want to go first?
Yes, I think the sort of three-step approach that I mentioned before is really important with this. So they have a lecture where we cover the theory, whether it's in terms of methods or statistics. Then they have the workshop, which is very guided and practical, but they're still doing it. And then the lab class is far more them doing it and being really independent. So I think that kind of scaffolded approach week by week, and each week they get something a little bit more complex than the next step on, is really important. And then that all gets applied within their bigger lab report, where it's mainly a project that it will be structured for them, but they will have a certain element of independence within it. And I think repetition is quite difficult to get because you don't have that much time across the academic year. But I think repetition is one of the most important things in terms of getting them to be able to integrate the theory with the practice, and then to be able to apply the critical thinking to it. I think getting them, if they just do it once, it's very difficult for them to map everything onto each other. So I think, yeah, doing it in that way, that kind of scaffolded building and repetition, it really helps.
Daniel, I think repetition was something you really built into the UCL curriculum. I remember in my second year designing and running about 8 different experiments. What does that look like at UCL now?
Yeah, I think the issue with teaching some of these abstract things, this sounds a little glib, but to some degree it does solve itself when they're making the experiments themselves. So if you take an idea like operationalization, that's quite a hard thing to explain, or a confound, right? It's surprisingly difficult to get across. You can use lots of examples and so on, but when it's a problem that they've got to solve, how do I take my idea and put it into stimuli? They run into all these difficulties, and that's just a much better way to learn, right? We've known this for some time, that project-based learning just inculcates this stuff better. So these things cropping up as problems they have to solve rather than abstract definitions that they have to learn in their methods module makes it much easier for us.
That's brilliant. Thank you. We haven't had a lot of questions come in, so please, anybody who's on the call, if you've got new questions based on the what our expert panel have been talking about, do please drop them in the chat now. Please don't be shy. This is a great opportunity to ask our experts whatever little questions you have. And you may think that your question, it's a great question here, I think. They're saying we've been finding a mixture of recordings and interesting live lessons similar to what Julian's mentioned has been wonderful. And so thank you for all the excellent ideas. Great. There wasn't actually another follow-up question. Sorry about that. Everyone's done such a great job of answering what everyone needed to know. Keep the questions coming. I'm going to continue asking questions. Daniel. Well, so one of the things that we're trying to make sure happens at Gorilla is that the students, or make easier to happen, is that students, by studying psychological methods, are able to take these new methods and techniques into whatever career they may choose. And they might choose to be into academia, but we know most students don't stay in academia. They go into other industries, so marketing, charity, finance, healthcare. How do you think these research method skills will impact students' future career capabilities and outcomes, and how might that in turn sort of, I guess, improve the future for all of us? Julia, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I always saw these as critical thinking skills. Things go wrong, things sort of need to be figured out, and especially with programming and sort of starting from zero and having that end product. And the way to that end product may be extremely difficult. It may be extremely easy depending sort of how you are wired, but the process in and of itself teaches you so many transferable problem solving methods and approaches and ways of thinking. I've always thought about programming, whether it be actual programming or on a GUI like Gorilla. It's sort of you develop a way of thinking and you don't get very far if you're not expecting things to go wrong. And that's...
Yeah, I think you're entirely right that the problem solving skills of experimental design really help develop that resilience to the future problems that you might find in your career. Joshua, how about you? Because I know you've flirted with academia and industry. How do you see these skills transferring?
I think they should transfer incredibly well. And I think it's very important that students are picking up these kind of transferable skills during these courses to take into industry. I think I think learning about research methods and understanding, not just understanding kind of rote learning statistics, but I think hopefully developing a real kind of passion for statistics and actually an excitement for kind of statistics and research methods is so great. Because I think, especially now that we live in a world now where there is so much content and information and media constantly saying, did you know that whether it's, eating 2 bars of chocolate a day helps stave off cancer? And I think getting that kind of training as an undergraduate to say, well, hang on, I did these kinds of experiments when I was a student and I learned these are the things that you need to think about when you're interpreting, and actually learning in a way, learning how to interpret the world. I think it's such a, lifelong lesson, no matter what you go on to do. And I think hopefully Gorilla's really helping people with that, just because it is quite intuitive, I think, in the way that you design things and helps you to think about that kind of structure in experiments.
Brilliant. Thanks, Josh. Daniel, how about you? How do you see this shaping your students' careers?
I don't know. That's quite a difficult question. What I would suggest, just to be vaguely hopeful, so at the end of our course, we had a little panel where we invited non-academic psychologists or people who have sort of one foot in applied psychology to come and talk to the students and answer questions. And we had one guy who was on the SAGE panel for the government advising on behavioral science, and another person who was a graduate student at UCL about 2 years ago, now runs the cabinet office in behavioral science, very talented young girl. And it was great to see her sort of zooming through the ranks and having such influence quite quickly was quite impressive. And there was a discussion about things like, sorry to bring both politics and the pandemic into the conversation, but there was quite a useful conversation about evidence and the role it could play, and the students seemed very rapidly were taking on these ideas. So we discussed, for example, about a year ago, if you can remember, Boris Johnson delayed the lockdown because he was worried about behavioral fatigue and the science behind behavioral fatigue, that we didn't follow the rules for long enough. And several academics in my institution, other people were sort of saying, what is that, behavioral fatigue? We're behavioral scientists, we've never heard of that, but it sounded like a sciencey thing. And we sort of discussed it with the students. They were thinking, well, what would the evidence for behavioral fatigue be? How would you test that? Is there any evidence? And quite quickly you find out, no, they just made up this term so it sounded sciencey and was a reason not to delay the thing. But quite quickly we had this discussion, not in terms of politics, but in terms of the evidence. What would the evidence look like? Has anyone gathered evidence? So they are able to bring behavioral science into the discussion much earlier. That's the hope, anyway.
Victoria, would you like to share your thoughts?
Yes, I think one of the things that I've always tried to do a lot with my teaching is, I think as we kind of alluded to already, some students aren't particularly keen on research methods and statistics. And I think sometimes they like to put it in a bit of a box and separate it out. And it's like, well, I'm studying psychology and here's all the fun stuff. And then I have to do this necessary evil to get through. One of the things I've tried to do is kind of link the research methods and statistics in two different ways. One is into the employability side of things quite explicitly. So actually in their very first lecture of their degree, which is with me, I go through the key employability skills that are desired by employers, and then talk about how that maps onto what we're teaching them in research methods and statistics. And I think sometimes we design these things thinking about employability, but maybe it's not made explicit enough to students. So we've been making a lot more effort around kind of making it far more explicit. So, we're teaching you in this way so that you have this skill. We're getting to do group projects because of the employability. But in having it linked to employability and making that really explicit is something that we've changed quite a lot in the last couple of years, and that's really working out well. The other thing is kind of that link to real world, so and critical thinking, and making them see how this stuff is actually really relevant to their life, and particularly with everything that's going on at the moment. So one of the ways that we do critical thinking exercises in first year is we give them a research paper that's been talked about in the press, and they have to go and find the press coverage and then compare the press coverage to the actual paper and see, how good is it? Has one paper represented it better than the other paper? And are different kinds of papers representing this scientific finding in different ways, and why might that be? And then looking into, okay, well, who's the funder of that piece of research, and all that kind of thing. So making those links between what happens with the academic journal articles and what they see in headlines. So I think those two elements, really doing that as early as possible, makes what we're teaching them far more tangible, and then hopefully get some of that engagement going.
Those are such great ideas, Victoria. I particularly love the media example. I can see that's tremendously helpful. I love the Science Media Centre. You must know their resources. They're absolutely brilliant. And if you don't know them, do check them out. Google Science Media Centre. They have academics commenting on headlines and to tell journalists what they should be saying. And it's always like, it's the story behind the headline. It's absolutely brilliant. Before I started Gorilla, I used to... before I went to UCL to study psychology, I used to work in the city. I used to be a quantitative analyst, so had really good data analysis skills. And I think one of the most brilliant things from the research methods course is the data skills that you use. Data skills are highly valuable and really important and can be used across a wide range of industries. So I think students often struggle with those. Some of the students struggle with them, some of them don't struggle with them, but some struggle with them. It is really hard. It's a real stretch. It goes a long way beyond what we learn at A-level maths, but these are tremendously valuable skills. And in psychologists, they're not only learning to use these skills, but also to communicate them as well, which is the sort of, the epic skill of being able to be a quantitative analyst and have all of those communication skills too. Now, according to my timetable, we've now got to the time to go back to the panel, each with the one most important thing for listeners to take away today, and their one Gorilla wish. So if Gorilla was to do this one thing in the next year that could make your lives better, what would it be? Joshua, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. So I think with hindsight, Joe, you know about this, because I spent the first month trying to put together Gorilla Academy. I think I did the typical academic thing. I found a free piece of software and I tried to make it work. And I spent a good probably month, 6 weeks working with different kinds of freeware, going through different Google and Reddit forums to try and get it to where I wanted it to. And after a lot of work, I think Facebook had obviously been tracking what I was doing, because I think it sent me an advert saying, why don't you try this page software? And I did a demo and it worked amazingly. It did everything I wanted in a few clicks. So I remember talking to Joe a bit about that, and Joe said, obviously, how much your salary and your time is, and how much a license is. Do the maths. If a month of your time costs more than a license, buy the license. And I think I can't stress enough how good it was to just pay that money and to buy actually a good piece of software. And I think working with online content more and more, there are so many great online tools out there. And I do think universities and I think departments do need to think about that, especially for lecturer well-being as well, because what I know happens is that most of us will either spend our evenings and weekends making free tools work, or we're going to have to do the other. We're going to spend 9 to 5 on that, and then think in the evenings, oh God, I've still got that marking, and redirect our time like that. So, I mean, step off my soapbox in a second, but I do think there is something to be said for that. I think it's just such a good investment spending money on a good piece of software, and that saved me weeks now of time putting together online content. That's definitely my big hindsight, I think.
Was that the transcription software?
No, that was just Camtasia.
That was Camtasia. Okay.
And just using that rather than I was using the free thing OBS before, which did kind of work, but it was a lot of fiddling, and I could never quite get it to where I wanted it to be.
Okay. Daniel, for you, what's the most important thing for listeners to take away today?
I don't know. I don't feel it's my job to tell people to take stuff away. But I would underline the fact that to take the plunge a little bit, well, not you take the plunge, throw your students in at the deep end, and so long as you give them the tools and the support, you might worry that they'll sink, but most of all, they will end up swimming by themselves. So to sort of get over that hump of nervousness and to trust them to find their own problems, try their own solutions rather, and their own problems. That would be my recommendation.
Brilliant. Julia, how about you?
Don't expect it to be what you know or what you want it to be. I think I was saying earlier before the webinar to these guys, took me but 3 days to 3 full days to design this practical, and one day of it was trying to get it to be exactly what I had done before in a different context in face-to-face. It's never gonna be exactly that. In face-to-face, you can put people in front of a program and be like, okay, off you go, crack your head for 20 minutes, you probably won't get anywhere, but we're doing this just to get you engaged. You can't do that online, and that's frustrating, but that's sort of the reality of life. And if you get too hung up on it, I think the creative process can be hindered. Once you're like, okay, I have this is what it can do, how can I work with that? And in terms of a wish, or are we doing
give your wish now, that's fine, I'll come back to everyone else.
I think I would like to, I don't know how to describe it, but have a more dynamically usable space. So like I showed how to create sort of 8 different versions of something that all needed credits applied, and only that whole thing took me about 4 hours to put together. So I think if this picks up and more of us are using Gorilla for teaching and learning, and it's actually worth investing for you guys, it'd be nice to actually be able to create virtual classrooms on Gorilla that everyone has access to.
Yeah.
But I realize that
I think we already have that, Julia. Daniel, you're using our teaching tools, aren't you, extensively?
okay.
We use them to share materials. Yeah, you can upload, you can share a project, and then the students all sort of clone it, and then you can see their work and so on. Yeah.
Yeah, brilliant. Now, Victoria, how about you? What's for you the most important thing for listeners to take away?
I think one of the big things that's come through over the last sort of 10 months in particular is not, I think sometimes when we do stuff, it always kind of it's prepared and it's done and it's ready. And I think one of the things that's really valuable sometimes for students that I've really kind of noticed in the last few months is it's okay to see us struggling a little bit and making mistakes and getting things wrong. And I think that makes it far more tangible to them that things don't have to be perfect and exact and precise. And I think, you know, one of the things that's happened in the last 10 months is it's kind of forced us to have to adapt and do things quickly and put stuff forward and then go, oh God, that's not the right way to do it, or I could have done it better, and adapting and changing. And I think that's actually been really valuable for the students to see in lots of ways, because I think sometimes what they're trying to aim to achieve is something that maybe is not so achievable. Whereas if they can see us sort of trying stuff out and playing with stuff and making mistakes and then working it out and going, right, that's it, that's how you do it. I think that can be really valuable. So breaking down some of those barriers and not being afraid to kind of sometimes say, I'm not sure, or I did it wrong, or let's try it a different way. And it can make you feel a bit vulnerable as a teacher sometimes, but I think that actually can be quite a valuable teaching tool.
Yeah, it's one of the things that I've had to step up in my leadership role here at Gorilla as well, is giving the staff a fuzzier direction with less of an idea of the path they're going to take to get there, and trust that they, as long as they understand the outcome that's desired, that they'll find a way there. And actually that independence is itself a really valuable learning experience and will help them grow to their next level of their capability as well. Now, Victoria, what would be your like feature wish for us to add into Gorilla?
I think one of the things that's been really interesting and helpful has been it's how we blend the resources that you have and the kind of the experiments that are already set up and the resources in terms of sort of the videos on how to do things, and how that then integrates with our kind of, right now this is how we're actually applying it and doing it particularly with it in our module. And so that's been quite interesting over the summer, kind of putting together our little bits that kind of, okay, now look at this bit and apply that bit and trying to integrate those. And I think that's I guess sort of making that tighter and thinking about how that happens, which is probably as much us as Gorilla.
We've spoken to technicians before about that as well. It's like, well, I'm creating lots of resources which were not only useful for my team but also could be useful for other people as well. Is there any way that I, like, as well as your open materials, could there be like a documentation repository where we can collaborate more easily? So it's that
kind of link between the generic and the specific, particularly when we're doing it for assessments.
Yeah, I could really see that. I'll have to take that idea away to think about what we can do. Daniel, how about you? Do you have a Gorilla wish?
Yeah, and I constantly bug Nick and ask him to do these things, but I have two. Sorry, one is very boring. One is a randomizer, because at the moment, if you want to randomize something, you have to have a line on the spreadsheet. Sometimes I don't care, so on Gorilla just to pick the ISA at random or pick the screen condition at random, and I don't want to list all the things.
Yeah.
Just a virtual dice roll. That was a very nerdy background thing. And then the more interesting thing that I would like is just before lockdown, I started to do this research that I was really excited about, measuring the heart rate and the physiological engagement of audiences in a theatre together. And then lockdown meant that was illegal to even think about doing those experiments. So what I want is a heart rate monitor that uses the webcam.
Yes.
Because I can't put physiological sensors on people, so I need some sort of way to track their physiology.
Yeah. Now, I think someone on Twitter has published their heart rate monitor that's built in Gorilla. Was it heart rate?
No, it's from Manos's group, actually, Manos Sakaris at Royal Holloway. So one of his postdocs has written some MATLAB code, I think, to extract heartbeats from the webcam.
And he's been collecting the data on Gorilla, so you'll have to bug him to make put his materials on open materials. We are also in conversation with, who are they, Josh? Mindtrace. Yeah. About adding those features as well. And yes, Nick's working on your just pick a screen at random thing without me having to add a script. It will hopefully be coming in September.
Yeah, I realized I could learn JavaScript to do it, but I refuse to do that now. You've got me in the mindset. The code, I want you to do it all for me.
Yes, well, and that's how it should be, you know. We you know, you've got to make us raise our game, and I know you set the bar high, but you know, we should clear it, right? So that's it for us today. Thank you for everybody for coming to our very first Gorilla Presents Teaching Research Methods online webinar. Thank you so much for being here. As I said earlier, we're going to be doing about one of these a month. If you have any suggestions of what else you'd like us to cover, please do put them in the chat. Maybe auditory research is your thing, gamified research is your thing. There have been some suggestions earlier. So I will go through the chat as well, looking for those. Then do let us know, and Joshua can try and find the experts to share their insights with them. I would like to thank all of the expert panelists here today. Julia, Joshua, Daniel, and Victoria, you've all been absolutely wonderful. Thank you for sharing your insights and your wisdom with us and taking your time out of what is a very busy time for everyone at the moment. Thank you very much. And with that, bye-bye. Have a lovely evening. Take care and happy experimenting.